Good afternoon. So perhaps Frank broke into Ralph's room to read his speech, but I am sure that Ralph actually hacked into my computer and read my speech. Ralph, did you? I also partially think that maybe I should join the previous panel because many of the themes that we've been discussing today are recurring ones. So maybe I'll just set the stage for the gentleman here being the token female. I noticed that. But I wanted to talk about three things: the West and the rest, the values versus val-EUs, which are two different things, and then very briefly about the role of culture in geopolitics, so just to set us off. We'll start by I wanted to start with something that we talked about already, that the dynamic of clashing values and growing cultural divide so visible in the emerging geopolitical constellations shows that the Western-inspired moment of universalism has passed. And the geopolitical momentum results from challenging the liberal privilege based on the universalist assumption that all societies and cultures can exist within its embrace. And the EU specifically is in a very precarious position here because it created a space of moral liberal order, an order that is not being revealed, that is now being revealed as not universal. In this sense, EU, but not Europe, I wanted to emphasize that, presents what Bruno Macias, a Portuguese politician and academic, defines as a civilization state, a state or a group of states that is organized around culture rather than politics. This reasoning echoes, of course, Christopher Coker's reflections on how different governments and movements are using the currency of civilization to their own political ends. Coker claimed that we live in a world in which civilization is fast becoming the currency in international politics, as, I quote here, the language of civilization has allowed politicians to prioritize battles to be fought in the future. Accordingly, the task of protecting specific cultural tradition becomes paramount where that culture is dominant. So Macias argues that EU is becoming reconfigured as a civilizational state, but we see how this notion of European as universal is being challenged internationally. What we see is that the various states show an increasing conviction that they have their own way of organizing their societies, political systems, and economic affairs. And they also say that measuring them with a yardstick that to a large extent is seen as a cultural import is a bland ally. Now, this brings us to the question of values. Civilization and culture that we talk about so much today, we really did not define at all. So I wanted to explain how I see things here, and I see civilization as an expression defining the development of the state and the civic collective life. And it is just like a very famous Polish academic defined it before the Second World War, a method of organizing the collective life. And for me, this is the key word here, method. Civilization is a method, the way that we organize ourselves. And this is the reason why you immediately see you cannot be civilized in two ways. You can't blend civilizations. There's only one way you can do it. Now, as the fruit of human inspirations and efforts that Bill was talking so nicely about, it always, willingly or unwillingly, becomes a career of spiritual symbolic content, influencing everyday experiences and human choices, and thus it is precisely culture and civilization that gives dynamic to history, to politics, to everything that happens in the world. It is so because values shape societal life. The belief that the most serious challenge facing civilization in the West, in its inevitable clash with other cultures, especially with Islam, has been repeatedly voiced in the last 2 decades or so, and threats and problems with the integration of migrant minorities that we discussed in a previous panel only seemed to confirm that diagnosis. But I do agree with something that appeared with the first within the first panel, that we observe the clash within a civilization, and it echoes what Benjamin Barber was writing about in his seminal book that I advise anyone to read. That's Jihad versus Macworld. Because it is really happening in our playground. But the problem that the West faces today, the new and radical thinking that takes place at the heart of our culture, is that the cultural resources of Europe, which for centuries were presented to the world as universal civilizational model, are now attacked from without and from within by those who are insisting that they are actually the vanguard and the truest and most progressive representatives of what we understand as Western civilization. And how we got here is very important to me, because I don't think we also understand the dynamic. When we say the collective woke, what does it mean? I think it's very critical for us to understand the process that allowed for us to happen to be in this precise place, because we are not dealing with the Gramscians. The first generation Gramscians, they marched through the institutions, they took over them, they hated Europe, they hated its history and everything it stands for. And to understand what it is like, it's not even enough to read Gramsci. You just need to look into the Hungarian Georgi Lucas and what he did or tried to achieve in Hungary. But then we had the second generation of Gramscians who already arrived at these institutions that were took over. These were not barbarians. These were sleek barbarians, affluent people who were brought up within that environment. They were educated. They were fueled also by an unwavering belief that they are blazing the trail of progress. Modern-day Huns, we could call them. They presented themselves as the natural successor of the Western tradition, but the subversion was already done through radical re-evaluation and redefinition of meaning, because war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, and all the rest is disinformation. Now, they have subverted the essence of European values, and they become European val-EUs, didn't they? That supplanted, the subversion means that we use the same labels like family or democracy, but the meanings is obviously entirely different. But by doing so, and this is important for our conversation here, they also eroded the whole fundamental of something that we used to call the normative power Europe. Why? Because if you hate everything that made Europe, then why would anyone else respect this? So let me move on, because what now we are dealing with is the third generation Gramscians. They hate the West, but they genuinely do not know it. Because what they think it is all the isms, racism, colonialisms, all the phobias that you can cram into political discourse and nothing else. And someone mentioned Haidt earlier on. Epistemic institutions only reinforce that belief and that knowledge. And if you want to check that if it's true, it's enough to Google anything or go to Wikipedia and it will tell you so. So they will say there is nothing like the European culture, but multiculturalism is our strength. But it's also a punishment for all the sins of the past. And so you cannot be proud of what your ancestors did, but you should definitely feel guilty for them doing all sorts of bad things. That's the essence of what we have now, what is now our offer and message to the world, from Europe definitely, but from the West in general. So third generation Gramscians have been so deracinated by liberal progressivism, they don't have a collective identity anymore. They are looking for one, and they find it, yes, of course, but they find it in other cultures and in other value systems, because they believe them to be both better and more righteous than the one they come from and they were taught to hate. So when Samuel Huntington first introduced the clash of civilizations in 1991, he said that cultural conflict was inevitable, and his argument was built on the idea that the Western world was simultaneously at its zenith of power and the peak of hatred towards it. Now, since then, the hatred only increased, but our power goes down, and this is important for us to remember. So the West is grappling with something that I would call just an autoimmunological disease. And like with all autoimmune diseases, this phenomenon is marked by body's defense system, the culture in this case, turning against itself, attacking the very society that fostered it. And these dynamics converge and are perhaps best captured by how mass migration internally is being ridiculed as conspiracy theory of grand replacement. I'm sure you've heard that. But at the same time, externally lauded as a form of retributive justice, because we do deserve it as a reverse colonization. And if you're not proud of your own culture, if you despise your own civilization, how can you expect that anyone else will respect it and adopt its axiology into their own? Why would you expect that this, the method that you organized your society is going to be the organizing principle of the international order? I'm maybe not as optimistic as Ralph is. I'm not really that pessimistic either, because I believe that we do take European culture for granted, since we do not know how bad its absence is. And we will never realize how much it's there until it's gone. Thank you.